Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel on how the Associated Press calls elections. I'm Sally Buzbee, currently a visiting fellow at the Nieman Foundation and previously executive editor of the Washington Post and the AP. This webinar is hosted by the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. It's being co-sponsored by the Journalist Resource, the Nieman Foundation, and the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. It's being recorded by C-SPAN to air later on TV, online, and on the app. We'll reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes of the webinar for Q&A. So if you do have a question for our panelists, please do submit it via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and we'll be asking it then. I'm joined today by four people who are deeply critical to the coverage of Election Day in America and the days after. Katie Bernard, a politics reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer, Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, David Scott, who is vice president and head of news strategy at the AP and who oversees the AP's race calling, and Robert Yoon, who is an elections and democracy reporter at the AP. So David, I'd like to start with you, just to kind of get a baseline for this audience. The US has such a decentralized vote tabulation effort on election night. Would you just describe for us briefly exactly what AP does to gather and tabulate that vote from president on down on election nights and how it distributes that to news organizations and the public?
Yeah, glad to do so, Sally, and thank you to the Shorenstein Center and the Journalist Resource for having Rob and I here today. I'm glad to be here with Katie and Tia. So it's a unique feature of the American democracy, right? When James Madison, Alexander Hamilton were drawing it all up, they delegated the mechanics of elections to the states. And back in the late 1700s, the thinking around when we would know who would win really wasn't the top of mind. And so our very decentralized, our very federal election system doesn't have a mechanism for essentially what amounts to thousands of local elections to come to completion until early January with when the electoral college votes are opened in Congress. And so in 1848, 2 years after the AP was founded, we saw that as a news story. And so we started doing what we say is counting the vote. Now, AP's not actually in the rooms with our election officials nationwide, literally opening ballots and looking at them. But what we do is when county officials and town and city officials in New England, or parish officials, as I'm reminded for our friends in Louisiana, report their votes, their outcome of what takes place at their level, we collect all of that information and we tabulate it. We add them up so we can see what the results are statewide, and then obviously in a national election, what they are nationwide. And that is part of our vote count effort. We are literally tallying the vote in the races for president all the way down the ballot, every seat in every state legislature that are on the ballot this November, so that America can know in real time from a nonpartisan, unbiased source who the voters have chosen to lead them. We do that work in a variety of ways. Something as simple as, although very logistically complex, putting a reporter in more than 4,000 county or city or parish election offices on election night to get the votes as they are released by those local election officials. Those are phoned in to our team of more than 800 people who take in those vote totals, perform quality assurance checks on them, perform analysis to make sure that they are correct, look for errors, and then ultimately distribute them to our customers around the world, and then publish via our own website, apnews.com. But also, we're not just doing it that way. Many counties publish their results online. So maybe we are scraping them from a website. Maybe they have a feed where they can offer them to us programmatically. Sometimes you can't do a scrape because of the complicated nature of their PDF. And so we have to look it online and manually type it in. We call that a manual scrape. So we're looking for multiple ways to get that vote. And we don't ever rely on just one. We always have multiple sources so that we can have redundancy in our system, but also perform quality checks and to make sure that the vote totals that we're getting are accurate. And then we distribute them programmatically around the world. No longer on the teletype. It's all electronic, all in code these days, so that people around the world can know again what Americans have decided on election night. In every race we tabulate, we also declare a winner. So we're looking at those vote totals. We're looking at other data points as well to answer a single question. Can the trailing candidates catch the leader? And when we have determined, our decision team has determined that is no longer the case and that the leader is the leader, that's when we declare a winner.
Can I follow up on that just a little bit? As you note, in addition to the vote tabulation effort, which AP distributes to customers, AP and a few others like the networks also call races, say who the winners are going to be. Obviously, all contingent on recounts and court challenges and things like that. It's not obviously an official certification of the vote by the government, but it is a essential determination of who's going to win. So can you talk to us just a little bit more about the race calling part of that, which I understand sits parallel to the vote count, but is a separate thing. And also, I mean, most importantly, how you do that, a little bit more detail about that, but also how do you balance this all important balance between accuracy and speed? We live in a country that I think is fair to say is desperate to know who's going to win this presidential election. And yet there are enormous concerns about the accuracy of the vote, challenges to the vote, that sort of thing. So walk us through how you actually balance accuracy and speed, what side you land on, all that kind of thing.
Well, we always land on the side of accuracy. So it is important to us at AP that if a race is ready to be called, that we declare that winner, that we are not waiting to do so. As our feeling is that if a race is ready and we haven't declared a winner, that is an opportunity for misinformation to take root, for bad actors who aim to misbehave to have their playground. So we care deeply about moving as quickly as we can, but that's always the secondary concern. We have to be sure that when we declare a winner, that race call is correct. We hold ourselves to the standard of 100% accuracy. If our team finishes this general election at 99.9999, for those of you who are familiar with the 5 nines concept from technology, that's not good enough. We'll not have done our job. We expect to be 100% accurate in our race calls. And so how do we do that? I mean, we are, as I noted earlier, Sally, we're looking to try to answer one question: can the trailing candidates catch up? Sometimes that's a really simple answer. I don't think that anyone would be surprised that, Donald Trump is probably going to win Wyoming. It's a very Republican state. I don't think a Democrat's won there in several decades in the race for president. Similarly, Kamala Harris, very likely to win Hawaii and Massachusetts. These are very Democratic states where they're likely to win by, double digits, significant double digits. In Katie's state, Pennsylvania, could be a while before we know who's going to win. And so what we're doing is we're looking at those vote totals as they come in, and we're trying to make an analysis about how representative are the votes that have already been reported. Will they be to the final outcome? Let's use Pennsylvania again as an example. The first votes that come in, they're all of one type of vote. So they're not advance votes and election day votes. So those first early results, they're not representative of all of what the final outcome will be. So we can't declare a winner there. We need to wait for more information to come in. And so that's the type of analysis we are doing. How of the vote count that has been reported so far, how representative of it is it of the final outcome, and how confident are we that the trailing candidates in the votes that left to be counted won't be able to make up the gap. And it's only when we're certain that they can't that we're able to call a race. And in a very close race, that might mean waiting for the vote to go to certification, for election officials to say there are literally no more ballots left to be counted. I can think back to the 2022 election where the state of Alaska had some races that went to ranked choice voting in their system. And literally one vote was the difference between whether a race would be declared for a winner because that one vote put them over 50%, or that one vote was the difference between them not getting 50% and then going to the ranked choice process. So we are looking across the spectrum And don't let anyone tell you that your vote matters, because every election year there will be races that Rob and I work on where one vote made the difference.
I think that there could be confusion among people who don't follow this process as closely about why races are called on election night and when official certification of vote results by officials happen and all that sort of thing. Do you plan to make clear to your readers that court challenges could occur, recounts could happen, that there will be somebody who is going to certify that vote? Is that part of what you communicate? Do your customers and the public know that? I guess I would say.
Well, I hope they do, because we've spent a tremendous amount of time this year and in years past, but this year more than ever, on trying to explain how we do our work, how we count the vote, and how we declare winners. And Rob and I being here today with Tia and Katie is sort of definitely part of that effort. But a court challenge or a recount, that all goes into the analysis of, can the trailing candidates catch the leader? So if there's a court challenge in a race, we take that into account. What's the argument being made? Does it have the potential to disqualify some ballots from being counted? Does it have the potential to add some ballots to the count? How does that impact what the lead is? And so that's something that we would take into determination before we could declare a winner. Similarly, with a recount, a race may proceed to a recount. But our research has shown very definitively that in statewide elections, recounts change the margin by hundreds of votes, not thousands. And so a race that may go to a recount, because let's say it's under half a percentage point of a victory, but in a race with 10,000 or 10 million votes cast, that's hundreds of thousands of votes. And so a recount won't move the margin by that much. And so we take that into consideration as well. So all of those things that could potentially impact what the final vote totals are, that all goes into our analysis.
Okay. I know many people on this call are probably aware that there have been groups of academics and NGOs who are in favor of good governance, in favor of strong understanding by the public about elections, for news organizations to be transparent about race calls or race projections, to be transparent about the certification process and all that, just essentially to explain as much as possible about how elections actually work. I know that AP has announced efforts to be, even more transparent as possible about decisions this year compared to the past. Can you or Rob, whichever one of you think is most appropriate, sort of briefly tell us about those efforts? What are you going to, as you put out the vote count, as you put out race determinations, what are you going to be telling the public about how you're making these decisions or how you're not making these decisions?
Well, for our audience, let me tell you just a quick story here. Uh, in 2014, Sally Buzbee, then the bureau chief of the Associated Press in Washington, recruited me to come be the politics editor there. And back in 2014, in that midterm election, when we declared a winner, we were simply sending out a headline. It was an AP News alert. It was 120 characters, and it just said so and so won. And that was good enough. In that moment, 10 short years ago, that was enough. Our audiences today demand more. They want to know what goes into those headlines. They want to read into the stories. They want to know how we have determined that someone has won. They want to know why we aren't calling somebody the winner. So in the last year, we have completely rebuilt how we cover the story of elections to focus on that explanatory journalism. Basically, we've tried to take all of the conversation that was taking place in the newsroom at the decision team when we're debating whether a race is ready to be called or not, and turn that into journalism. One of the key parts of that, Rob, I'm coming to you, was hiring Rob Yoon, who is our lead explanatory reporter on elections and on our decision team. And he's a part of this effort to be much more transparent about what goes into our vote count and into our race calls.
Okay, so Rob, let's turn to you. As David has said, you play a big role in this explanatory journalism. So I'd like to just, if you don't mind, ask you a couple hypotheticals. Let's say AP has not called a race, and there are questions that are starting to burble up on social media. News organizations are being attacked. There's allegations of fraud going around. What do you put out? Are you putting out something that explains why you haven't called a race or what you're looking at, and talk us through some nitty gritty. I mean, what will that actually, like, how will that be written? What will it say?
Sure. Well, so you mentioned certification when the race result becomes official, and as David was saying, a lot of the time, most of the time, it's possible to determine who the winner is going to be before you get to that point, weeks after the election of the election being certified. However, a lot of times in the recent past, we've seen that races are sometimes so close that you just need to let the process play out before you find out who's going to win. But what we've learned, especially in the last few cycles, is that it's not necessarily possible or a good idea to let that process play out in silence, because as David was saying, that's when that creates the opportunity for misinformation and to take root, and for bad actors to try to use that silence to advantage their agenda. So we're going to look for these moments throughout the election night and the period afterwards to try to identify these moments where putting out nonpartisan, independent information is going to help the understanding of what's going on in a race. So as you mentioned, a big part of that will be for the most competitive races in the presidential race, the ones that we are all expecting are going to decide the presidential election. If there comes a point where it's been there are a lot of votes in, and it's election night is in the rearview mirror, but there still hasn't been a winner called, that's an opportunity for us to explain what we're doing, pull back the curtain, and talk about why there hasn't been a race call. An example of that, since Katie and Tia are both here, I'll talk about Pennsylvania and Georgia. But in Pennsylvania in 2000, that was obviously a close race, as it is again this year. But when I'm going to say when we woke up, but a lot of us were already still up. But at 6 a.m. on Wednesday morning, Donald Trump was ahead by almost 700,000 votes. And you could just look at the statewide totals and think, wow, it's looking good for Donald Trump, not looking good for Joe Biden. And so you might reasonably think like, well, why haven't they called the race yet? And so in that case, and I think it's possible for these situations to pop up again this year. You need to look at not just where the votes have been counted and who's doing well in what areas, but we look at where the votes haven't been counted and how might that affect our calculations. So at that point, at 6 a.m. In Pennsylvania in 2020, we knew that there was still a lot of uncounted ballots in Philadelphia, and that there were still a lot of mail ballots that hadn't been counted because with COVID, there were a lot more mail ballots. They weren't allowed by state law to process them much before election day. So we knew that there was this big chunk of ballots that needed to be reviewed, and it was going to take time to do it. And then also by that point, we knew from the votes that had been cast, that mail ballots were overwhelmingly favoring Joe Biden. So knowing that there was a large amount of mail ballots to be counted, calling the race at that point would basically be ignoring the fact that we've got all these possible Biden votes out there. We know we're going to need to review these before we make a decision. And so that's the type of information we'd want to put out there, explaining why a call hasn't been made. And then there was the opposite situation in Georgia where the Democrat took a big lead, and Raphael Warnock took a big lead in the Senate race, but then that closed, that tightened up as the votes were counted. Although Warnock, still ended up winning, but those are situations where just looking at the statewide totals might make it seem like there's an overwhelming winner. Someone's winning by a lot based on the votes that have been counted so far. But we're going to try to weigh in at those moments and explain what we're seeing and why it doesn't necessarily mean we can make a race call at that point.
Okay, so let me ask you two other questions related to that. One, I think, is when you're doing this explanatory journalism, is that something that is going to be usable on social media, for example? Like, I mean, a lot of the information around speculation about what's happening on election night is going to be playing out on local media. So is the AP putting any of this out on local on social media, or are you just giving it to your customers, or where will we actually find this explanatory stuff, I guess?
All of the above. Yeah, so it is a big, it's something that, AP subscribers have made a part of their own coverage of the election, but on our own website and platforms, we're making it available there. We put out a big package of pieces a couple weeks ago in advance of the general election, explaining different aspects of election night, how things work in terms of the election process, but also here at the AP, how we go about doing it. So that's available to everyone right now. We also write a kind of a preview of each state, all 50 states in the District of Columbia, of the key races that are going on there, and also some of the things that our decision team will be considering in each of those states, whether it's competitive or not competitive going into the election. Those are called decision notes. So that's another thing that we make available to our subscribers, but it's also on our website, and it's available for everyone to access.
Okay, so Robert, I want to answer you just one other thing, then I want to turn to Katie and Tia. But one other thing that happens sometimes, obviously, is that as a state or a county is releasing election results, sometimes that vote count in the past has fluctuated in like a key county or something like that. Like, there have been instances where a county has reported a vote count and then has sort of like corrected that or changed that. That tends to be something that is very disruptive on election night, and where a lot of misinformation and conspiracy theories. Can you tell us, like, how do you report something like that out? And are you talking to the officials and say, like, what just, I'm assuming that elections officials are making honest mistakes and correcting them, but, a lot of people are not going to assume that. So talk to us about that reporting process. And also, is that the sort of thing you're going to be explaining on election night if people are seeing that sort of thing happen?
Right. So, yeah, short answer, yes. Anything that's going to, create confusion, or where there's an opportunity for, misinformation to, take the place of real information. We'll put out what we know, whatever context we have about how votes are counted, how votes have been counted in the past, or what the voting patterns are in different parts of the state, to help explain any of that. But yeah, we do a lot of work ahead of time to try to understand what's happening in each state, what the procedures are in each state. As you mentioned at the top, elections are decentralized, so there's not one uniform approach that every state has to follow. Everyone does it differently. Some places count their absentee votes first. Some places count them last. And in the environment where we're in now, where these mail votes have been, predominantly Democratic, election day votes have been predominantly Republican. If you count all your mail votes first, that's going to create this big Democratic advantage in the beginning. If you count all your election day votes first, it's going to look like a big Republican advantage in the beginning. So yeah, and we've laid out a lot of those details in our preparation for election night that you can find on our website now, and decision notes and other parts of our reporting. But yeah, we'll do that on election night as well. Another situation, like in Minnesota, for instance, Minnesota, like a bunch of other states, their initial reports are a mix of election day ballots and mail ballots, and so there's not necessarily there. So if you look at how the vote lead there might fluctuate more, switching back between the Democrat and the Republican, and if you look at those points, it's usually like here's a bunch of mail votes that were released, so that made it good for the Democrats. Or Hennepin County just finished their count, so that looks good for Democrats. Or here's a bunch of election day votes that makes it look good for Republicans. So that might make it makes it a little more challenging to explain what's going on there. But yeah, if it gets to a point where people are getting confused about it, or it's not clear what's happening there, we'll step in and just share what we know. And that might be in the form of a longer form article, but we're also putting out kind of short, quick hit blurbs as situations arrive to be reactive as election night progresses.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So Katie and Tia, you both work at news organizations in very critical states this year. You're sort of on the receiving end of some of this stuff. Can you each talk a bit about how you plan to incorporate AP results into your reporting, and also how you plan to carry those forward, how you plan to explain election processes to your local audiences? Tia, would you go first? And then we'll circle to Katie. And then I have some hypotheticals to ask you guys too.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me today. I should start with the fact that at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we rely on the Associated Press exclusively for all race calls. We do not say someone has won a contest according to the unofficial results until the AP tells us that someone has won a contest according to the unofficial results. We know that there will be lots of national outlets and different websites that also call races. We rely on the Associated Press. Now, that is what we will use to say who won or lost based on the results. However, of course, we're going to fan out across the state to cover the candidates, cover the results, speak to voters. We'll also, in Georgia, particularly after the 2020 election and Georgia becoming the epicenter of a lot of the misinformation and disinformation about the validity of the results of the election, we've dedicated a lot of resources to covering the election system specifically. So I have colleagues who will be with the Secretary of State in election offices all day, monitoring any issues that may arise. Unfortunately, Metro Atlanta is also notorious for long lines and precincts not opening on time, precincts being held open later, just the normal things that happen on election day. So we'll have a very robust news organization around the election, the contests, and the mechanics of carrying out an election. But the AP is going to be essential for us deciding, who ultimately won those contests.
Okay, thank you. Katie, do you want to weigh in with some basics here? And then I have some hypotheticals for both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here today.
It's amazing you guys have time to do this. So we're very grateful for you all to appear.
Things are busy, but they'll get worse. Much like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Inquirer relies on AP for our race calls. And the reporting looks fairly similar. We put out a story ahead of the election explaining to our readers, how we call races, that we rely on the AP and what the AP process is, so that they have an understanding when they pull up our website and see the, tab of results, where we've pulled that from. And then similarly throughout the night, we're going to have folks at watch parties, we're going to have folks in the newsroom watching results in real time. My role specifically, I cover election administration. So in addition to watching the results come through on the AP, I will be calling our local counties, asking how many mail ballots they ended up getting in, how many they have counted, how many they have left to count, seeing if all of the machinery is running as it's supposed to, or if there is going to be a slowdown because, a machine broke down unexpectedly. And so that is kind of the work that we'll be doing that day. And all through that, making it very clear that an AP call does not equate to the counting being done, that election officials will continue counting ballots until they certify that race, even if, we can look at the results and go, okay, this person's going to win. And I'm doing a lot of that explanatory reporting ahead of time as well, explaining what the lawsuits are that could impact the results of the election, debunking misinformation that we're already seeing go out in Pennsylvania, and helping make sure, voters understand what that counting process looks like and kind of that like red mirage effect that we've talked about ahead of time.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So you're very much going to explain certification is a process that election officials do. This person, has essentially won the vote, but there's a whole sort of administrative certification, administrative quality control, all that kind of thing.
Yeah. So our reporting, has, we always cite as unofficial results in stories that reported out, as called by the AP. And then I'll have separate reporting kind of explaining that counting process, and that, the election is not technically done until, officials certify it, a week or two later.
Okay. So let me ask you each a hypothetical. I'm actually going to put out two hypotheticals. You can each answer whichever one you want. So let's say, and this is either on election night or in the days afterward, right? Because there's obviously a chance that some of these races may not be determined in that night or at 5 o'clock the next morning or anything like that. So let's say that the lead in a vote in a critical race fluctuates, right? And what are you going to do? Like, what do you anticipate doing to explain to your readers why that happened? What do you anticipate that you're doing? Are you going to be on social media? Are you going to be on your website? Are you going to be writing? I'm really sort of interested in the nitty gritty. Obviously, you're going to be reporting, but how are you going to? Because we're assuming that there would be skepticism. That's where the fight over election results tends to consolidate. So tell us what you are hoping to try to do in a situation like that. Katie, do you want to go first, and then Tia? You're both
Sure.
potentially going to face this, right?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. For the Inquirer on, election night and big news days, the top place that we tend to report out news is on our live blog. So if we saw, a major fluctuation in a race that was confusing voters or led to some skepticism, what I imagine we would likely be doing is looking at what we already know that might be able to explain it, calling election officials who might be able to help us explain it, or campaigns if that would make sense. And then likely first filing that update to our live blog, where it then may or may not be pulled out into a story itself or folded into other coverage.
So at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we will be using live blogging as well, and that does help for people to kind of see the updates. But I also think a lot of it is the context that's needed as you report results. Because again, yes, we will wait on the Associated Press to call a race, but if we need to report on a race before it's been called, then we'll say things like, early voting shows candidate A in the lead. However, half of precincts still haven't reported, or it's so close and provisional and absentee ballots are still being counted. We've got to give, what we do is give people the context to help them understand what still needs to be done and why a race hasn't been called, if it's too close to call, or if it's just too many votes are outstanding to call it. If it's not being called, especially if we get to, we've got print deadlines on election day. So if we've got to put an article in the paper before a race is called, we'll say what's still out there. And I think that's really important to help people understand why things might change. And then when they do change, to bring voters along on that journey. We saw that in 2020 in Georgia. And I believe even in 2022 with our Senate race, things change as different pots of votes come in, as different types of votes come in, and you just have to explain to people what is contributing to the changes.
Okay. And then I have another question for each of you, for both of you. If there is very pernicious disinformation, let's say that there is something that is circulating on social media in your communities that says, person X has won, or even says, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has reported that blah, blah, blah has won, or something like that, and that's not accurate. Okay. How aggressively do you think your newsrooms are going to push back against either like legitimate disinformation or just ignorance, whether it's malicious or whether it's non-malicious? How aggressively do you think your newsrooms are going to try to combat that? And where will you combat that? Will you address this forthrightly? Will you ignore it? It's a difficult question, I know. I'm curious where you land on that this year. Tia, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Katie?
I'll start. I think it's tough because I feel like the AJC, it really depends on where it's being repeated, what's the medium, what's, who is repeating it. And I think then that will come from on high, how we would respond. But I think in general, to your point, Sally, we do try to make sure we're really transparent. And if we see something taking off that is misinformed, we try to put some original journalism around it. There have been a lot of conspiracy theories, even this election season in Georgia. There was that viral story about one voter saying that their ballot was changed and it was trying to make them vote for a person that they didn't want to vote for. Well, yes, that went viral on social media. The AJC tracked down the truth and did our own article debunking what happened and explaining what can happen and how to avoid it, making sure you check your ballot. Georgia's voter system is touchscreen, prints your ballot. You got to check. There are different places where you can check it before you actually turn it in. So I just think resources are important. Even now, the what's going around with ballots being burned in boxes. So how do people know how to check the status of their own ballot? Those are the things, trying to, as much utility and tools that people know they can go to the AJC and say, I read this on social media, but go to ajc.com and see if the correct information is out there, I think will be important as well. But, specifically for your question, I think it's going to be on a case-by-case basis on how we would respond.
Okay, thank you so much. Katie, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with Tia. It's something that we're going to handle on a case-by-case basis, and that we already are handling on a case-by-case basis. Yesterday, former President Trump put out a tweet claiming 2,600 fake ballots and materials submitted in a county in central Pennsylvania. It was a situation we'd already reported on that was verifiably false, and so we were very quick to put a fact check out, correct the record, and I shared it across social media. I think often it's the conversation of how widely spread is this, is it verifiably false? Is it something we need to check into and then make a decision once we have the facts in front of us? But it's something we're preparing for, especially in that period, after polls open and after polls close, because we're already seeing misinformation and we know there will be more. Election officials I talked to in Pennsylvania consistently say that period between polls closing and an election being called are the most dangerous for misinformation spreading and being accepted as fact. And so it's a period where it requires a lot of vigilance to know what's going on and to be able to quickly fact check things and decide how to handle it as a newsroom.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. So David, back to you, although there's some questions that we're going to ask of Katie and Tia, but David, just quickly back to you. One of the things obviously that is true this year is that the election may not be determined on election night. So can you just give us a very brief overview of what happens in the days after the election? I think we all have a memory of what happened in 2020, where it took all the way to Saturday for major networks and the AP to call Pennsylvania and then the presidency. Or do you staff 24/7, or literally, what do you do in the days after the election?
Yes, is the answer to that question. Not a lot of sleep uh, gets done. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Pennsylvania is one of the changes in the law there is that they're not allowed to take a break. They have to keep counting until they're done. Now, that doesn't mean everyone has to stay on shift, but every election office has to keep counting. We thank Pennsylvania for that. That was a lovely innovation. Um, we're at work. If election officials are tabulating votes and they're releasing results, AP is there to count them, and so we don't take a break until all the votes are counted, and we usually get pretty good guidance from election officials. Hey, we're shutting down, and we'll be back at such and such a time, or here's when the next update will be available. LA County in California is um, they don't release anything on Wednesday. They say we'll see you on Thursday, and that's when we'll provide the next update. So that's also part of our transparency and explanatory effort, is letting the public know when they can next expect results from election officials. I mean,
Okay.
but Sally, just on this point about what takes place over those days, and thinking about some of the things that Katie and Tia have said in the reporting that they're doing in fighting misinformation, I think one of the things we can all do a better job of is just helping the public understand the scale of what the public does on in a US general election. 160 million people are going to cast ballots. 98 to 99% of them are going to do it on a piece of paper with a pen that then is going to go through a voting machine. And local election officials are going to tabulate those votes and report them out. Think about the scale of that's involved. It's an amazing thing that voters do and election officials do every 4 years in a presidential election. And the fact that we will know likely within a couple of days who the next president is, and maybe depending on the outcome, even know on election night or early Wednesday morning, is an amazing thing. And it's really a testament to all those people that Katie and Tia cover in the states, and those election workers, and what they do to carry that election out. And I think, you know, more reporting and more explanatory work about the scale of what America does when it goes to the polls is an important thing to remind all of our audiences about.
Okay, great. We have a bunch of really interesting questions flooding in from the audience. So I'm now going to turn to those, and they're for all of you. So I'm going to ask a couple of you each one by one, but there's going to be questions for all of you. The first one I think is for David or Robert, and it's a very good question. It asks, in the past, mail-in and early voting lean Democratic. Now it seems like some Republicans, at least, are also embracing early voting. How does that shift change your process on predicting races, on race calls? Is it still reasonable to assume mail-in and early voting favors one party, or is that in flux? David, you
Well,
want to answer that?
yeah, sure, Sally. So I'll say that when it comes to this, past is prologue until it's not, and part of our job is to make that understanding. I mean, I think one of the things we're seeing this year is, are Republicans voting more in advance, or is it Republicans, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. Are more Republicans voting, or is it just that more Republicans who in past elections would have voted on election day are choosing to vote early in person in some states? And so is it a turnout question, or is it a shift in how people vote question? And that's something that we'll need more data to understand. I mean, certainly the partisan nature of how people choose to vote has been one of the more interesting developments in race calling, and sort of just the American body politic over the last several years. Um, I think that the most important thing is not to make any assumptions about what's going to happen moving forward. You look at the data, you look at the evidence, and you react and you report on that data and on that evidence. I mean, Katie, you should know that you're reporting on what the denominator is going to be and how many votes are left to be counted. That'll be top of my reading list on Tuesday and Wednesday for sure.
Okay, good. There's actually a question, Tia, for you at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about how you're thinking about local races that the AP actually does not plan to call. Will you make those calls yourself, and do you have a process for doing that? In other words, I know that there's, the AP goes down quite a ways, but there's obviously sometimes local races. How do you handle those? I think this is an interesting question just because it's relevant for other people.
I would first tell the person who asked that question, you would be surprised how down the ballot AP goes. So David's shaking his hand. I don't think there are any races we would call without the AP, especially in a major city like Atlanta. They're going to call like the city council races and things like that. I guess if we do get to a race that is localized enough, we would go off of the Secretary of State. They do eventually kind of unofficially say who has won races in Georgia. They have, the little checkbox where they say who's won. So I'm assuming that would be our backup, but I'm pretty sure the AP goes pretty far down. It's not always on their like social media, because they don't always get to that level of being posted on the national social media. But AP usually does its own little checkbox on all these down ballot races as they start reporting results. So we're pretty dependent for the AP on everything. But David, can you tell me if I'm wrong on that?
Well, we're not going to school board. We're not going that far down the ballot, but all state legislative races, we declare winners in those. All the ballot measures, we declare winners in those, and certainly in large elections, big cities, mayor, some definitely all statewide races, some significant judicial appointments, those types of things. Yes, we do report. I think in a lot of places, Sally, where we're not counting, it's exactly what Tia described. Media organizations wait for the vote count to go to certification.
Yeah. Okay. But it's pretty far down. It's way, way down. So I think that's a useful thing for this group to know. I wanted to also, Tia, you and perhaps Katie could weigh in on this, although I'm sure it's relevant for the AP also, but I think it's most relevant for local newsrooms. One of the people on the call has asked, what guidance are you giving journalists in terms of preparing on election day or the days afterward for potential harassment or violence? We're all aware that in Arizona in 2020, there were people who went outside the state election and were protesting, outside state election officials protesting, on the day after the election and things like that. So this is an issue, obviously, for elections officials, but it's also an issue for the journalists who are out trying to report on this race. Can you tell us just a little bit about what guidance you're giving your reporters or your editors are giving your reporters around this issue? Katie, you want to go first, and then maybe Tia can weigh in?
Sure. In general, the basic guidance from the Inquirer on down to the reporters is, if you encounter anything, a phone call, an interaction, an email that is threatening, report it up the chain. And the higher ups, the editors, will take it from there, whether it involves, getting law enforcement involved or something else. And then it's kind of the gut thing. If you are out reporting at a polling place or elsewhere and you are uncomfortable, you fear for your safety, just get out of there. It's not worth sticking around if you are at a polling place and a voter is being threatening towards you. Just like as an example, it's leave, let your editor know what happened, and then make a plan from there.
Okay, great. Tia, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I also think people, I think a lot of people who are worried about us journalists and worried about our safety, it's much appreciated, but unfortunately, so much of this we're just kind of used to. So there's a high bar for what someone would say to me on social media that would make me feel threatened, because you're getting, negative feedback all the time on social media and in emails and things like that. So I think it's only the really serious threats that even cause a blip for us to even pause. I see Katie shaking her head, you know what I mean? A lot of times it doesn't even make us flag anyone because we're just used to it. But if it's something that does come across more serious, or it's a clearer threat or seems a little bit more personal, we may flag. But for the most part, I think we're just kind of trained to ignore it and keep moving.
Well, that's a very brave and courageous response, I have to say, and a terrible state of affairs, that's the state of affairs. But thank you for saying that, Tia. That's obviously a really amazing thing for you to say. So the questions continue to come in and they're quite good. So I'm going to ask just a few more. David, this is really for you, I think. It's a kind of a technical question, but it's really interesting. So I'm going to ask it. How often do the AP and other news organizations follow up to see whether provisional ballots that were cast during an election were actually ultimately, counted or rejected by elections officials? In other words, does that tell you anything about, what the rate of provisional ballots or something like that is? That kind of deep research about what actually happened, how did they make decisions? Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Sure. And the answer to the question is after every election, we're investigating that. We're following it all the way to the end. And it's exactly for the reason that you described, and I think the questioner was thinking about, which is trying to get a sense of how many provisional ballots might be counted, and what their impact might be on a race. And that's information that obviously comes afterward, what the final outcome is, but we do have that information at our fingertips so we can know what the potential impact is within the context of, again, past is not prologue, or past, however that phrase goes. So we have to be careful, we have to be cautious. And so that's where a lot of, in a race that's that close, it's coming down to provisionals. A lot of additional reporting is going in, a lot of discussion with election officials about how many ballots they have left to count. And we're really diving into the weeds there, as we need to do, to determine who a winner is if a statewide race comes down to provisional ballots.
And I'm going to ask a follow-up question. All this research that you have about how states operate, is that something you give customers? I mean, is it available to people? Is it available to, because it really is such a decentralized system that you really do. I mean, Robert said something about, having to know the nitty-gritty of how Minnesota does something versus how another state does something. That seems like extraordinarily valuable information. Does that propel you? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it goes back to something that we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is all of the things that go into declaring a race. We used to sort of think about that as research, and now it's journalism. So Rob just completed this project where we publish what we call AP decision notes, which are very deeply reported fact sheets almost about what takes place in every state, what has taken place in the past in every state. And again, we see in our audience, and Tia and Katie, I'm sure you see that in your audience as well. They want to know this information, right? They want to know how their democracy works. And so all of these things that sort of used to be in a binder at your desk on election night that you would have available if you needed it, and maybe you'd use 2 facts out of the 10,000 that are in that binder. We're looking constantly for ways to turn that into journalism because our audience wants to know about sort of the mechanics of how their democracy works.
In other words, they might in the past have not bothered to learn that, but now they are more interested in that. This brings me back to, there was an Ash Center panel with elections officials, and they actually said some of the same thing. They said that even though there's been this terrible sort of disinformation effort, there's also been a lot of citizens who actually want to know more about the nitty-gritty of how the process actually functions.
I think we've all learned. I think we've all learned over the last several cycles, some of the details about how these things work. Katie, I'm curious, did the Inquirer have an election administration beat 10 years ago? Probably not, but now it's a key part of covering politics is how the mechanics of elections actually works.
Okay. All right. One more question, David, for you, and then, or for Rob, and then I have another question for Katie and Tia. These are all great questions from the audience. So, what happens if one candidate declares victory before all the votes are counted, whether that's in a Senate race, whether it's in the presidency or something like that? Is there a plan for minimizing any misinformation that could potentially occur if someone says, hey, I've won, and you don't actually feel that that person has won? What do you do in that circumstance?
We report the news. And it's really that simple. Candidates declare victory, candidates concede. That really doesn't impact when we declare a winner. We've had circumstances in the past where a candidate has conceded. We haven't declared the winner. New vote information comes in, and they want to take that concession back. So we we're listening to them, but we're driven by the data. Ultimately, after polls close, what the candidates say doesn't matter. It's what the voters have said, and it's in their ballots. That's what matters.
Okay, thank you for that. That's very helpful. Katie and Tia, one other question. You are both in states, and we're in states in 2020 where just this thing dragged out forever. And I'm just sort of curious in terms of putting out the news, you've got to write repetitive headlines like day after day. Your audience is getting frustrated. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you handle the likelihood that we may not know the outcome for days? This is a question from one of the people listening to the panel. How will you do that? Is it an opportunity for education? Is it such a fraught time that no one's really paying attention to what you're saying? They're just interested in the outcome, or how do you view that period if it happens this year?
It was 4 years ago. I felt that there was so much news, even with it took a few days for us to know who was going to be president. And some of that was because we were waiting on Georgia's results. But there was still other news that we had to cover, because you have congressional races, and we had some competitive congressional races. We had our Senate races, which had been pushed to a runoff. And I think that's what's going to be different this year, is that there aren't really other high profile races on the ballot in Georgia. So if the state's results are lagging, and if the results from Georgia are tying up the overall results of the election, I think there will be that pressure to make sure that as we're kind of in this vacuum of waiting for news to happen, we're not so thirsty for headlines that we start kind of writing the same thing over and over, or getting into tangents just to try to generate headlines. I think we're just going to have to be thoughtful about it. At the end of the day, there is always so much news. It all might not be election political news, but in a state like Georgia, in a city like Atlanta, there are other things for people to consume as we tell them, hey, votes are still being counted. This one thing, the presidential election, we don't have new news. Now, there will be other things, though. We'll be covering counting. We'll be covering challenges. If it's close, there are going to be challenges immediately. So I do think there will be a lot to cover, but I don't necessarily think it's helpful if we feel like we've got to do minutia of every incremental change in the vote counting.
Okay, thank you. Katie, any perspective on that?
Yeah, fairly similar to Tia. I mean, there will be other stuff we're covering. There's a very tight Senate race that we'll be watching for the results in. Namely, that's the big thing, as well as some close House races. But for my role, as kind of the election administration person, I'll be working closely with our courts reporter, who will be tracking, potential legal challenges that also often come up when, things are going long. That's when fights over which mail ballots are going to be counted come up. That's when fights over which provisional ballots are going to be counted come up. And so our approach to that as we get into that stretch will be, yes, reporting on how those ballots are being counted, on how those challenges are being presented, but contextualizing it all within how it will matter towards the ultimate outcome. Why these challenges are being brought, what the, whether or not undated ballots get counted, what that will mean towards the ultimate outcome, if we have a sense of whether it will help one candidate or another, and making sure to infuse all of that coverage with context so voters understand why the election hasn't been called, and also what's still out there and what sort of difference it could make.
Okay. All right. Well, we are at time. And I think we got to a slew of the questions from the audience, and really, really happy that those questions could be surfaced, and deeply appreciate all four of you, who I know this just must be an incredibly busy week for, but so valuable for you to be able to talk about this, for people on the call to learn and understand, and perhaps reach out to you with additional, questions, because we do want to make sure. I mean, I personally find that this focus on transparency is so interesting and so different from the past. So just huge thanks to all of you, and thanks to everyone who joined this webinar today. And good luck in the next week and the next 2 and 3 weeks. Thank you all so much. Today's session, as Caroline said, was recorded, will be available on the Shorenstein Center website, and as we said, will be on C-SPAN in the future. So thanks to all of you, and have a great day.